High Performance Training 2. High Performance Training 2 is a 7-day program, and day 1 is going to serve also as the intro to describe the format and to give you more information on what's to come. On day 1, specifically today, we will describe volume as it pertains to periodization. The next days to follow, we will go through intensity, recovery, peaking and tapering, periodization, fun, and communication as they pertain to high performance training. Keep in mind, there is also a high performance training PST, which is a 2-week program, and Coach Shannon Talks, which is a 30-day program, and I'm mentioning those in this intro because if you use all of them on an ongoing basis, on a continuous basis, on a persistent basis, you will not only fortify your ability to apply high performance training, you will also be an example and a role model for all those around you. And I haven't talked about this much at all, but the concept of team is very important. Earlier on, I may have described performance enhancement team as explained by the United States Olympic Training Centers, and I didn't go into a lot of depth. I just kind of mentioned those words, but I'm going to explain it a little more here. Performance enhancement team is designed to give you what you need with regard to strength and conditioning, psychological skills training, sports-specific skills training, nutrition training, and all of the areas that are going to enhance your ability to perform at a high level. Essentially, what a lot of sports scientists around the world and even the Olympic Training Centers, United States Olympic Committee, United States Olympic Training Centers believe that you could have a coach per one of those specific topics. In this particular volume, I'm going to point out that it's not impossible for you to coach yourself in all of those specific topics. However, for you to coach yourself in all those specific topics, you need to have what I like to call essentially a mastery of the basics. And that's why I mentioned in this specific intro of volume, High Performance Training 2, High Performance Training PST, and Coach Shannon Talks. You yourself can become a high performance training athlete if you master the basics of all of those performance enhancing concepts. Okay, so let's jump right into volume. Volume is the amount of training that you do. Okay, that's the basic definition. What specifically does that mean, and what are some examples of how volume could look, and what is the importance of volume? Okay, the importance, we'll answer the last question first. The importance of volume, and many of the topics that I'm going to be describing in High Performance Training 2 is under recovery. Under recovery is a term that a lot of sports scientists use to describe overtraining. If you are undercovered for weeks, sometimes months, you can become overtrained. If you become overtrained, very hard to have very good performances, very hard to even train, very hard to even compete because the mind just is not there. So I'm actually, have done High Performance Training 2 after High Performance Training PST. Again, and the PST stands for Psychological Skills Training, because so much of the mind is tied into training. Okay, let's get back to volume. So volume in an example I'm going to give now could be something like this. I'm going to give you a mesocycle, again, which is a training month, and I'm going to give you amount of minutes, which would be the duration of time that you would be training live in wrestling, so that you can get a clear example of what volume specifically is. Okay, in a 3-week mesocycle, which is a training month, we would have 2 building weeks and 1 recovery week. Let's say this is the start of the season, although it could be any part, but I'm giving you specific minutes so you can see how this would work. Typically, power practices are an hour and a half long. Sometimes they go to 2 hours, depending on what type of training you're doing. If you're at an Olympic Training Center, if you're on a college team, or if you're on a high school team, it may look like one of these. Now, if you're having 2-a-day practices, it may be a little bit different, and that's where volume becomes really important. Okay, the example for wrestling in live minutes, if we have 5 practices a week and we're doing a 3-week mesocycle, 2 building weeks, 1 recovery week, the recovery week is where you would bring down the volume. But what is volume again, and what do I mean? The volume would be in live minutes. So first week we would wrestle 12 minutes per day live. That's outside of all of the other training that you're doing with the warm-up and the drilling and the technique that's outside of that. In an hour and a half or 2-hour practice, you're going to wrestle for 12 minutes. Now, you would do that 4 to 5 times a week. So you would just multiply, let's do 5 times 12, which is 60 minutes. That's 60 minutes of live wrestling, so that you're breaking it down into 12 minutes a day. Does that make sense? Okay. The following week, you would go up. Typically, sports scientists suggest that you should go up roughly 30% and not more than roughly 30%. So you could go up anywhere from 1% all the way up to 30%. When you exceed going up 30%, and I'll give you an explanation of what that sounds like here in a second, you have the, you're very close to overtraining if you continue to do that over the course of months and weeks. So the point here I'm describing is you may go up if you did 12 minutes in the first week. If you multiply 12 times 0.3, if you have a calculator or a phone, you could probably do that. You would get 3.6. That would be the top amount of minutes that you should go up if you're looking for high performance training. So if you had 12 minutes in the first week, now you could go up 3.6 minutes, so you add 3.6 plus 12, and that gives you 15.6 minutes if you were using the top level, which is 30%. So the first week you would do 12 minutes. Then the second week you would do 15.6. You could go down the following week if you were doing a 3-week mesocycle with 2 building weeks and 1 recovery week. Typically, I would go down back to 12. So that gives the athletes a little bit of a break. However, in the beginning of the season, it doesn't feel much like a break at all because they just did 12 minutes the week before in the first building week. So that's an example of how volume could be attached to a mesocycle. Now, if you watch some of the other videos that I have, specifically on the realcircle.com, and you click on any one of those videos at the top which says high performance training, it goes into depth and a little more information can be provided specifically over several different topics. I kind of combined a bunch of them there so that you could get the gist of it. Anyway, if you go and look at that, you can see how we've sort of broken it down over the course of, I think it's 8 weeks and 16 weeks, and you can see the amount of minutes over time. Again, you can go from increasing in your mesocycles 1% to 30%, and typically I would do between 20 and 30% increase in actual training minutes, live wrestling training minutes. Now, another piece of information that's important with the actual volume of training and that specific example, when you're wrestling live, you expend more mental and physical energy because you're going at a much faster pace in terms of your intensity. Does that make sense? So when you're drilling and wrestling live, if you were to put them on the scale intensity-wise, and we're going to have a whole other discussion on intensity tomorrow, but if you were to put them on the scale of intensity, wrestling live probably would be 10 because that would be the highest that you could go. Drilling can be anywhere from 1 to 9, so it would always be lower than actually wrestling live. However, because there are different types of drilling that you can do, and we'll describe that a little bit more tomorrow with the intensity session, your practice can be harder or easier based on the amount of live wrestling that you're doing, the volume of live wrestling that you're doing, and the volume of intense drilling that you're doing. So to give you a better example of that, I'll give you an example of when I was a coach at the United States Olympic Education Center. We typically had 10 to 11 practices a week, and this was training athletes to make the junior world team and senior world team and the Olympics teams, junior Pan Am teams, and senior Pan Am teams. So it was an Olympic training center essentially. So we were doing a lot of different things, preparing the athletes for high performance training. Nonetheless, we had 10 to 11 practices a week. In the morning sessions, typically we would spend about 90% of the time just working on technique. And it was not drilling, in a level of 8, 9, or 7 even. It was usually learning how to do the skill, drilling at what I like to call the learning pace. So in the afternoon, we could actually pick the whatever they learned that morning. Now we could drill, again, I'm using numbers to describe intensity. 6, 7, 8, and 9, where they would actually be drilling it faster, more like a competition speed and competition intensity. Because we had morning practice in the morning, the volume in the morning practice of live wrestling was usually under like 2 minutes or so. Typically we would only do parterre in the morning, because in the afternoon, again, we're talking about the underlying thing being under recovery. If you do the same amount of volume with the intensity, now you're running into, overtraining your athletes. So I just gave you an example of how the volume can change based on how many practices you have per day. And again, tomorrow we'll go into a little bit more detail with intensity. For now, though, I'm going to jump back to a volume so that you can kind of see a program that has one similar to what we did at the Olympic Training Center. Okay, inside those 10 or 11 practices, typically we didn't be on the mat all the time. In fact, we were never on the mat 11 times. The most that we were on the mat would be 6 times. Typically it would be 5 times, because a lot of times we didn't have practice on Saturdays. But I'm going to give you an indication of how a 10 or 11 practices per week session could look. So if we were doing 11 practices, typically we would have practice on Saturday, and we'd do a 2 a day on Saturday, and it would be a combined session with something like 30 or 40 minutes of strength and conditioning in the weight room, followed by 25 to 30 minutes of wrestling. And the design there was to actually overreach the athletes, which is we'll talk a little bit more about overreaching tomorrow with the intensity session, and then the following day with recovery. But quickly, overreaching is pushing the athletes beyond their normal limit in terms of volume and intensity to get a response, so that when they recover, they can go a little bit higher than they did the last time. Anyhow, getting back to the 10 to 11 practices per week, typically 5 of them were wrestling. Typically 3 of them were strength and conditioning. Typically 2 of them were one was actually like a recovery day. Wednesday was like we would either swim, or we would do some type of game, or maybe sometimes we would just stretch and sit in the sauna. And Monday was a little similar to that, except we would do a little more drilling actually off the mat. And we would also play a game on those days. The idea there was to actually enhance and maintain their fitness while also giving them a break from the different type of volume that they would be doing in the wrestling room. And the reason why I bring up all of those different practices, because the design and intent of each one of those practices was different. If you have different practices with different intents, now your volumes can actually change because you're working with different muscle groups. In other words, we could do 3 days of strength and conditioning because we were doing 5 days of actually, or 5 sessions of actually wrestling. In other words, we were never going to have the same volume of wrestling and strength and conditioning, because that would be too much. Because wrestling was our main job, main goal, main purpose, we had more volume of training with the wrestling. But we also understood that you have to maintain strength, so that we had to do sport-specific strength in the wrestling room, and we also did what I like to call just fundamental or basic strength in the weight room. And the idea behind that is to reinforce the strength that you're learning and developing in the wrestling room with actual weight room strength. So there's 2 different types of volume that are going on there, and I'm pointing that out because with 10 to 11 practices a week, you can't have 10 practices on the mat. Again, you'll run into overtraining and under recovery with 10 practices of wrestling on the mat. So because those practices are different, the volumes can actually be different. So the volume in the weight room is a completely different type of training as well. There are a lot more breaks and breaks have to be built in with your wrestling practice too. But because, again, we'll go into a little bit more depth tomorrow on intensity, because the intensity is completely different in the weight room, you have a lot more breaks. So in an hour and a half practice, let's say the volume of training, I'll use numbers again, the volume of training in minutes, it may actually be like 17 or 18 minutes, right? But it takes an hour and a half to 2 hours to do that work, because even though the volume is a low number, very similar to the wrestling live, I mean, it's as intense as you can get, right? I mean, think of this. Think of doing squats with your body weight 10 times. Think about doing it 300 times. Now, you probably couldn't do that in a 2-hour session. Now, you might be able to, but I'm just pointing to, because the volume or the intensity is so high, the volume in minutes of actually doing the exercise can be low. Another way to suggest the same thing is actually wrestling. When you're wrestling in a live match, typically in high school and college, a 6 or 7 minute match is the volume or the duration of it. Can you imagine doing an hour and a half match, the length of a practice? Yeah, probably not. And that you would be under-recovered and overtrained if you did that. So I'm just giving you a couple of different examples of volume as it pertains to high-performance training. And I'll finish up by suggesting that having a very good understanding of volume, and the first example I gave you of the building weeks is a very important concept. Just to review that, typically in a high-performance training program, you'll have mesocycles, which have undulating volumes. Undulating means it's a wavy pattern, meaning that they're not always the same volume. They go up and then they go down, they go up and then they go down. And then a high-performance training plan, typically your volume will undulate the whole season, meaning it'll be changing the whole season. It may be going up at some points, it may be going down at some points, and we'll give a better description of that when we talk about recovery and peaking and tapering. But for the most part, I want athletes and coaches to understand that the volume typically is not the same all year, and if it is the same all year, now we have the opportunity to run into undertraining and under recovery. However, if you're in a periodized training program, the volume is going to undulate, and that means you're going to be changing your volumes all year. And in a couple of days, we'll talk about recovering, peaking, and tapering.